Do you wanna? Do you mind like field of religion as a whole, or do you just want to keep it on like something hyper specific, or are you like indifferent?
It depends I'll have more stuff to say that's helpful if it's something I've been working on or thinking about. But if you just want to, I don't know, if you want to just ask me random questions, I guess you can do that.
I'll run like the first, like the ones like you've been working on, and then I run the other ones, and then I skip the bad ones, just make up some. But
Sure.
do you just wanna like introduce and like say where people can find you and stuff?
I really hate doing that type of thing. I don't really care about that.
Yeah,
do I have to?
No, you don't have to. I mean, like use of reason, right? And then you have the podcast on YouTube, which is
Sure,
like very good. And then you have like fill of papers where people can find the stuff you've written on like the Grim Reaper and on the Kalam.
Well, the Grim Reaper thing isn't published yet. Keeps bouncing around. I find unsympathetic referees.
Oh, sorry.
But we'll get there. It's fine. It's what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, my bad.
But yeah, I mean, published papers. You can look me up on Phil People or Phil Papers, either one of those.
Yeah.
And they have my most recent stuff. I still have this paper coming out in mind. It's taking absolutely ages just because their production people are not dealing with COVID very well. So it's taken months and months. It's been accepted. The final draft has been confirmed, all of that stuff. It's just they need to send me the proofs so I can okay the very final like copy that they haven't made any spelling mistakes or anything from my draft. That's still about to come out, but I've been saying that for ages, but it is just about to come out. So that's not available yet, but it will be soon, and I can share, I can share the original from Dropbox if someone's interested in that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I just pinned like your Phil People, and I also pinned like your blog, Use of Reason.
Cool.
Yeah, there's a good blog post on Frege's argument for Platonism there. If anybody wants to read that one, that's really good. So there's like a question about the Grim Reaper paradox. But could you just like explain the paradox and its relation to the Kalam, and then I'll read the question.
Okay, so the paradox is I talked about this the other day when we did a different version of this Ask Me Anything thing. So the paradox is first brought up by this metaphysician called Jose Benedetti, and he plays around with loads of different versions of the similar idea. And interestingly, he's a guy who is a friend of the actual infinite. So although these days it's mainly used, in the philosophy of religion, it's used as an instrument to argue for finitism. Benedetti is a kind of infinitist, right, arguing for the infinite. So it's got this kind of unusual origin. But the argument can be put, well, it's a kind of paradox. It can be put in numerous different ways. One version of it has a man who's walking along a path from point A to point B, and unbeknownst to him, halfway down the path, there's a god waiting who will make an impassable wall appear ex nihilo if the man is to make it halfway from point A to point B. But there's also another god that's halfway between point A and that god that's in the middle, and he's also waiting there, and he's going to make an impassable wall appear if the man makes it to that point. And there's another one that's halfway between point A and that god, and etc. We just cram more and more of these kind of gods in an ever diminishing space, each one halfway between the start and the last one. Now the thing about that is the guy isn't going to make it to the end of the line. Right? He's not going to make it from point A to point B because there's an infinite number of gods, each of which would make an impassable wall if he was to get as far as they are. So he's obviously not going to get to the end. But pick the first god I mentioned, the one that's in the middle. Well, he's not going to get the opportunity to make his wall. And the reason is because the guy's not going to get as far as him, obviously. Because if he was to get a half as far down the line, then the other god who was waiting there would prevent him from traveling any further. So he's definitely not going to make it to the halfway point. But it's also true he's not going to make it to the one at the quarterway point either, because there's another one in the eighth of the way point. And what's going on here is that the guy can't make it to the end, right? Because he's going to be blocked at some point. But there's also no specific point at which he's going to be blocked, because for each god, there's an earlier one. So no god is the one that would stop him. And that's basically the architecture of the paradox, is that there seems to be these there's different ways of explaining it, and you can draw the contradiction out more formally than that, of course. But that's one way to understand the difficulty. You can't get to the end because of an infinite number of obstacles, but also none of the obstacles are going to stop him. And that's kind of the way this works. So another version of this is your kind of Grim Reaper argument, where you're thinking about a guy trying to survive over a period of time from like 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock. And if he makes it halfway, then a Grim Reaper will kill him, right? So the only difference here is we're talking about an increment of time, and instead of a god making a wall, it's a Grim Reaper that's going to kill him. But everything else about it's exactly the same. So we have these, you can construct versions like that in space or in time, doesn't make any difference. And then what this plays on is just simply the fact that there's no kind of first Reaper or god or whatever. So you'd actually don't have to cram them into ever smaller spaces or durations, or you can just spread them out evenly over time, just as long as there's no beginning, no first one. So this is where Kuhn's kind of grim messenger version of the argument comes from, where you just imagine messengers who pass on a piece of paper from one to the other, let's say every day. And let's say time has no beginning, and there's one every day for the whole of the infinite past. And they're passing along a message to each other. And what they're going to do, they all have programmed the same way or whatever to write down today's date, if and only if there's nothing already written on the piece of paper. And this is basically the same as saying, the God is going to build the wall that will stop the man walking, if and only if he's made it that far, if no other wall has been made. So it's the same sort of condition. But in this version, they're going to write down today's date, if and only if none of the others have written down their dates already. So the guy who's, today's messenger, he gets passed a piece of paper. Now, is he going to write today's date on it? Well, if he did, that would mean that there'd be none of the previous ones would have written their date on it already. Okay, fine. So let's imagine that's what's happening. Well, if none of the previous ones had written their date on it, then the one who was handed the piece of paper yesterday, he would have also thought to himself, oh, none of the previous ones have written their date on it. I'll write my date on it. Right? So it can't be that the one today would write his date on it, because if the situation obtained such that he would write his date on it, then the situation would have already obtained such that the one from the day before would have written his date on it. So it couldn't be that today's one writes his date on it. So then you're thinking, well, it must be that he opens it up and reads a date on there. But which date is it that he reads? Right, now we're back to the same kind of familiar problem with the first one. There's no date that it could be, right? It can't be yesterday's date that's written on there. For same reasoning, right? If it was yesterday's date on there, then the day before yesterday, the Reaper would have opened it up and seen there was nothing on there and written his date on. So it couldn't be yesterday, but also it couldn't be the day before yesterday, because you just iterate the same reasoning kind of backwards down the chain. So you find that it couldn't be nothing written on there, but also there's no date such that that could be the date that's written on there. So we've got these versions of the paradox. The one I started off with kind of seems to tell you that, one thing you might think it tells you anyway is that there couldn't be infinitely divisible space, right? You can't keep cramming gods in on a line in ever smaller increments of space. There's some kind of point, some quanta of space or something where it can't be broken up any further. That might be one way of thinking about what that means, because if that's right, then there actually is a first god that he bumps into. and that's the one that stops him from moving any further. And you might think in the Grim Reaper case, right, where it's going to kill Fred sometime between 11 and 12, if time can't be infinitely divided, then there's some smallest increment of time, and that means there's some first Reaper, and that's the one that kills Fred, and none of the others do. And you might think also that in the Messenger case, there must just be some first point in time, and that one just writes, 0 years or 000 or something on there as the date from the very first moment of time, 001. I don't know what the date is from the first moment of time, but he would write that, and everyone else would just pass the message along, not write anything. So you might think one way out of this is just to bite the bullet and say time is not infinitely divisible, neither is space, and time must have a beginning. And that's basically what that's what finitists do. They basically say, yes, the infinite divisibility is shown to be incoherent, and infinite extendability, at least backwards in time, is shown to be incoherent as well. So, I mean, I can talk a lot about this, but one approach to this is to say we've got a paradox, and this type of response is a sort of metaphysical response, is to embrace some metaphysical claim about the world. And the traditional way of looking at this, going back to at least Quine, if not a long time before that, Occam arguably, is to say when you're making sort of theoretical, when you're spending your kind of cash in terms of theory, if you're spending it on ontology, making a claim about the way that the world is, then that needs to sort of pay for itself, needs to earn its keep by explaining stuff. So there's this trade-off between explanatory power and ontological commitments. I mean, there's more to it than that, of course, but like that's one nice way to sort of think about this. And the thought here is that the metaphysical claim is something you shouldn't, if you could not make that claim and explain away the data, that would be better. That's kind of Occam's razor. But that, as long as it does, in fact, get rid of the paradoxes, then that can be seen as a kind of explanatory power that it has, and therefore kind of justifies, make the cost in terms of ontology that comes with that, from saying, all those things, a kind of spatio-temporal finitism that comes with it. So yeah, that's how causal finite. They call themselves causal finitists, but in fact, actually, it should be called a kind of dependency finitism, because there are semantic versions of this paradox too. Like Yablo's version of this just has like an infinite sequence of sentences, like S1, S2, S3, blah blah blah, and each sentence is true if and only if none of the higher numbered sentences are true. And we got exactly the same paradox there. S1 can't be true. If it is true, that means none of the others are. But if that's right, then S2 would be true, because none of the higher sentences from S2 would be true, so it would be true. So the space and time, or even just about causality or something like that, you have to talk about in more general terms. So causal finitism is really just dependency finitism. And Proust acknowledges this in his book on this. Although I'm not sure how widely acknowledged outside of people who go into the details of the book, how widely acknowledged that is. So causal finitism is actually kind of general dependency finitism. And so it's considerable ontological commitment that's gone with that, but they think that they pay for it with the explanatory power that it has from explaining away all these otherwise pesky paradoxes. Okay, so that's probably enough to start with, at least.
Yeah, Quine had like this classification of different types of paradoxes, right? Veridical, falsidical, antinomious. Within which category would you say these paradoxes fell within?
I don't know Quine's classification scheme of paradoxes, actually.
Would you think, when you say a paradox, you don't mean it's like a contradiction, like of the form P and not P?
There is a contradiction if you take the premises to be true, and it, on there's a it depends what you mean by paradox. Some people will take paradox to mean a valid argument with true premises and a false conclusion, right? And that's one very formal way of saying what a paradox is. But in stated like that, one man's paradox is another man's reductio, because you can show. I mean, if the conclusion, if it seems like it's the conclusion follows from something, but there's a contradiction there, and that's why it's false, then you can reason by reductio to reject one of the premises. You can reason by reductio to reject the premise if there's one premise. In fact, what the defenders of causal finitism like Kuhns does is sets up an argument and introduces one of the premises as assumed for reductio, for the purposes of reductio, and he thinks all of the other premises are obviously true, and that then when you deduce the contradiction, what you have to do is go back and reject the thing that's caused the problem in the first place. And he thinks the problem is the premise, which was that effectively that there's no first cause. If you reject that premise and say there is a first cause, then you avoid the contradictory. You avoid the contradiction. So yeah, I think it is a contradiction. I can go into more detail about what I think the contradiction is, because I disagree with the way Kuhn's approaches that, but I don't know where you want to go with it.
No, I mean, like, we can go there, yeah, sure.
I mean, okay, so the details of Kuhn's way of looking at it, he sets it up like this, saying, look, we can picture a Grim Reaper as a kind of mechanism that could be constructed like an electrical circuit or something. And all it has to do is, for instance, take the messenger version. All that mechanism has to do really is receive an input, right, and then print out something if the input is in a given state. And that's really just trivially easy to construct, right? Obviously, a mechanism like that is easy to construct and could happen. I mean, it's the sort of thing that does exist. So it's possible that there is a inverted commas Grim Reaper, a printer machine that has that type of input-output setup. Right? It's certainly possible individually that there's one of those things, right? And he also appeals to a principle which he gets from Lewis, which is a recombination principle. So this is a principle in the epistemology of modality. So it's a principle that is like a guide for us to know what possibilities there are, right? So it's not a metaphysical principle. It's not telling us what possibilities are, but it's just telling us what possibilities there are. Right? And the difference is, there's all this chat about, are possible worlds concrete things that really exist, or are they like ersatz, kind of linguistic creations or whatever? Like, that's the ontology of modality. What are possibilities? But this is an epistemological guide saying, can we know what the landscape of possibilities is? Like, is it possible? Is it metaphysically possible, for instance, that I'm completely made of glass or something? Like, intuitively, a bit of me could be, I could have a glass eye, but could my entire body be made of glass or something, right? And if that's possible or not possible, that's the sort of thing that this principle is trying to help us get our heads around, which, the catalogue of possibilities. And so the principle just basically says, look, if something is possible, like, say a donkey is possible, and another thing is possible, like a sheep is possible, if they're sort of individually, intrinsically possible, then you should be able to combine them together so that there's a possible world that has both a sheep and a donkey in it. And it would be weird if they were individually possible, but then the combination wasn't jointly possible, right? So Lewis talks about this kind of principle of plentitude, right? It's trying to explain that there aren't any gaps in modal space, that you should be, those things that can be combined, that there's also another possible world for those things. So Kuhn thinks about this as a combination principle. We can think about it like a cut and paste principle, right? Like, so take a world which is a container, and then you take an individual thing from world A and an individual thing from world B and kind of cut and paste them into the container world. Now, assuming there's enough room in the container world for them, then what you've got is a third possibility, right? The world with both A and B in them. So he thinks, well, and you can do that, and you can kind of like infinitely cut and paste. So you could cut, as long as there is enough room, you could cut and paste infinitely many things from infinitely many possible worlds and jam them all into one world, right? And the cut and paste recombination principle licenses that as something that we can take ourselves to know to be possible. So he basically just says, look, an individual Grim Reaper is possible. So just think of infinitely many variations of that Grim Reaper worlds in which that Grim Reaper exists. Just cut and paste all of them, and then paste them into this one world, with which for reductio, let's assume has no beginning to it, and arrange them so that there's one every day, right? And that they print out today's date if and only if none of the previous ones have. And that's how it works. And then once you've got that set up, where you can run through, I was explaining it like I was doing a moment ago, or you can set it up formally and deduce a contradiction that follows from that. And then he says, well, look, individual reapers are possible, of course. Cut and paste principle is like a valid principle of the epistemology of modality, right? And the only thing that seems dubious here is this assumption that there's a world with no beginning to it, so that must go. So by reductio, he deduces that the world must have a beginning to it, because if it didn't, then there'd be a possible world like this, which was contradictory, and there can't be. So that's his reasoning. So he's using reductio there from the presence of the contradiction. Once you set it all up, when you've got kind of all of the architecture in place to generate it. So does that help explain how it's related to reductio?
Yeah, no, that was clear. I guess to close it off, could you just recommend like some literature that like maybe someone who wants to read more into this could like pick up on?
Yeah, so I recommend Nicholas Shackle's paper, which is called The Logical Form of the Benedetti Paradox, I think. Nicholas Shackle's 2005. So there's a bunch of people talking about this from like the late 90s, and I think Shackle gets it right. He sees it. He does a nice literature review of that stuff, and all of that's before. I mean, Kunz's Grim Reaper paper is 2014. I think Proust starts talking about it in 2009. So they're coming onto the scene afterwards. There's some papers by Laurenio Luna from 2009 too, who are thinking about this in terms of causal finitism. But in general, the causal finitists come on the scene later. But I think Shackle's view is right in 2005. And he basically just says, look, there's two propositions which can't both be true. And any version of the Grim Reaper scenario, any version of the Benedetti paradox, unwittingly kind of has both of these propositions stated in it at some point. Sorry, my laptop's just locked itself. Let me unlock it. So what he says is that there's been a kind of logical contradiction in the setup. And intrinsically has to be a logical contradiction in setting it up. And he thinks the right way to respond to that type of thing is to say, well, no metaphysical thesis needs to be advanced in order to kind of explain it away, because it's just simply logically impossible. And you don't need to explain why logically impossible things don't happen. It's just in describing the situation, you've contradicted yourself. And the propositions, call it proposition A and B. The first one says of some structure, whatever it is, whether it's time, space, alignments of Grim Reapers, whatever it is, there's some structure that has no beginning to it. It's endless in one direction. The second proposition is saying there's some condition that obtains on that structure. And that condition is for all items in the structure, for all X in that structure, some proposition P, arbitrary proposition P, is true at X if and only if it's not true at any of the previous Y's, right? So it's true, he calls it the at if and only if nowhere before condition. So you've got a combination of just saying there's an endless, a structure which is like beginningless, let's say. And the second one is says it's at if and only if nowhere before condition. And actually the problem is just having both of those. You can't have both of those at the same time. That's the lesson of the paradox. But it doesn't say that you can't have either of them individually. Right? Just because you can't have two things in combination doesn't mean that one of them is impossible. So, for instance, I can think of a number greater than the one you're thinking, and you can think of a number greater than the one I'm thinking. But we can't both think of a number greater than the one the other one's thinking of, right? So their combination is impossible, but they're individually possible. And in this case, his view and my view as well is that we're just seeing something which is jointly impossible, but not individually impossible. And the nice thing about that is, all things being equal, it's preferable to have a solution to a paradox that has an equal explanatory power, but has a lighter ontological cost, right? Occam's razor. And this has basically no ontological cost, because we're not saying anything about causality or space or anything like that. You're just pointing out that there's a contradiction involved here, and that's that. And very quickly, the standard response by causal finitists, so Proust and Luna in particular, is to make this version of a mysterious force objection, where they'll say something like, that makes logic like a causal agent that interferes in the world, preventing certain things from happening, and that's implausible. And of course, that's right. Logic isn't a causal force that makes things happen. But it just seems to me that there's no ground to the mysterious force objection, because it just completely misconstrues the nature of this unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. This Nicholas Shackle and my view, we're not considering it to be a causal force. Rather, and a nice analogy is, if you think about somebody trying to cross all of the 7 bridges of Königsberg. Now, it's impossible to cross all of the 7 bridges without doubling back on yourself, let's say. It's impossible to make such a circuit around that, around those bridges without doubling back on yourself. And it's actually sort of provably impossible to do that. And there's a proof, and Euler became famous by proving this. And, nobody thinks that there has to be, that treats mathematics like a causal agent that's interfering. Like, if you tried to do that one day, you wouldn't do it, you wouldn't succeed, and something will happen, like you will get lost, or you'll slip on a banana skin and fall into the water, or something will happen, or you'll get bored, or whatever. But you won't actually succeed in doubling back without doubling back on yourself, crossing all of the bridges. But there's no need to explain your failure by reference to logic or something staying your hand. That's insane. It's just, there just happens to be a mathematical proof that proves that you're not going to succeed. And I think the mysterious force objection sort of feels a bit to them more like it makes sense in this Grim Reaper sort of situation, but actually it's just exactly the same setup. And I think no one would agree with them that it's necessary to appeal to a mysterious force, or treating logic like a causal agent in other types of cases like this, like the bridges of Königsberg. And to me, that kind of just settles it. It's just obviously a misleading appeal to logic as a causal force. So yeah, to me, everything else being equal, a solution to a paradox that has an equal explanatory power with lighter ontological cost is preferable. They try and make things not all equal by introducing the mysterious force objection, and it just seems to me that that's not a very good objection. Doesn't really make any difference. And so it seems to me it's just straightforward to endorse something like this view of Shackle's, and that just gets you out of the problem. There's just, you end up just saying, well, why would I need to explain why something logically impossible doesn't happen? That's all, right? And so, just to be specific, in Kuhn's paper, what's going on there, I don't blame the beginningless time premise. I blame the application of the rearrangement principle, the cut and paste principle. Actually, what happens is, as soon as he cuts and pastes all of the infinite Grim Reapers into the beginningless universe, you've now got something that instantiates both the A and B conditions, and we know that there's a logical contradiction there. So what that means is the principle that said you can cut and paste these things into that world and what you have is possible is wrong in that case. That principle is not an infallible guide, and this shows you that it's wrong. It's much easier to deny that application of the rearrangement principle here than to think that you've proved time couldn't have a beginning. I mean, one of those is a kind of gross metaphysical claim, and the other one is kind of epistemically humble or something, right? Like, there's absolutely no reason to think that you've proven time doesn't have a beginning. What you should do is say, oh, I guess the principle of recombination doesn't actually apply there. Now, he thinks it's ad hoc to say that, as if all you're doing is saying, well, it gets me out of the problem if the rearrangement principle doesn't work. But it's not ad hoc because, I mean, you can't, if one thing is individually possible and another thing is individual, but their combination is logically impossible, then obviously their combination isn't metaphysically possible, which is what the recombination principle tells us. So obviously we should have a proviso on what we can rearrange together, which it rules out things that are logically impossible. Like, I can think of a number bigger than you can think of a bigger than me. You can't cut and paste instances of us both doing that, paste them together, and think that we found a world where we're both thinking of numbers greater than the other, because that's logically impossible. So that is an invalid application of the cut and paste or recombination principle too. So it just seems like it's a totally straightforward sort of thing that goes without saying, that you can't cut and paste things into logically impossible situations. But apparently Kuhns thinks it's ad hoc to say that. So I'm not worried by his view either. It seems very easy to diagnose the problem with that. So yeah, sorry, I'll shut up now.
No, that was great. Well, I guess that was enough on the Grim Reaper. I guess we can go on something else. Haiku asked, what do you think about the doctrine of divine simplicity, and does it cause as many problems as it attempts to solve?
I've never really thought about this problem too much, so I don't have anything really interesting to say about it, I think. So no, sorry. I mean, we can talk about it, but I don't have like a settled view.
We can take another question, and then we can get back to it if we run out of questions, I guess. Could you outline your views on moral realism? Are you a moral realist? If yes, how would you show that naturalists can ground objective moral values better than theists can? This was asked by Real A Theology.
Okay. Well, I do take myself to be a moral realist, that's right. But the question uses the word naturalism there, and I take it that naturalism, as opposed to theism, is almost supposed to be a dichotomous choice there. The world is either that naturalism is true or that theism is true, something like that. Although it's not quite clear to me what naturalism means. If it just means not theism, then fine. The brand of moral realism that I like has the term, the label non-naturalism attached to it confusingly. Confusingly for the kind of naturalism-theism dichotomy on the one hand, and then the kind of naturalism-non-naturalism dichotomy on the other hand. They really have nothing to do with each other. Well, they kind of have something to do with each other, but moral non-naturalists are not people who explain moral truths in terms of reference to theism. And you can be a theist and be a naturalist, according to this. So what I'm getting towards is that if you think moral truths are reducible to something, whether that's the commandments of God or statements about what brings pleasure and pain to animals or something, if you think the terms like good and bad and right and wrong are reducible to some other term like that, then you're a naturalist. So a non-naturalist is somebody who thinks that there really is no paraphrase or reduction of the meaning of the terms right and wrong in kind of other terms. So they are things that are concepts unto themselves. And you kind of, it's kind of tricky, but it seems to me you probably, at least one very sensible way to think about this is that you've got to have foundational concepts somewhere. Well, maybe you don't, right? But at least it's plausible to think that you do. So, for instance, you might think that truth is just something that's not definable in terms of something else. And, moral goodness or something, you might also think is a candidate of something that's not definable in terms of something else. The very foundational concepts, the difference between 0 and 1 or something, like really ultra basic things. They're basically just furniture, conceptual ground floor things that we've got. So if you think something like that, then you're a non-naturalist. And that's basically how I look at it. So I'm not persuaded that there is a plausible reconstruction in terms of the desires of agents only or something, so that like some action is right if and only if it satisfies my desires or something like that. I think that is a different concept to moral concepts. It's not, it overlaps, but it's not the same thing. Or these types of things are used to be fashionable about talking in terms of emotivism or something. When you say something is right, then what you actually mean is that you like it or something. Or even when you say that it's right, you're not actually expressing a proposition at all. You're just sort of saying yay. So it's kind of expressivism or whatever. So I don't subscribe. I think all of those are kind of implausible when you look at the details of it. And actually, I'm also not persuaded that the kind of naturalist reductions to things like pleasure and pain captures everything either. And obviously, I don't think that talking about it in terms of commandments given by all-powerful agent or whatever cut the mustard either. So I think that in a kind of, I mean, I can't prove it to you, right? But I don't think anybody can prove, like with a kind of syllogism or something, that moral realism is true. I think that what you have to do is look at a broad range of data that's relevant, data in a kind of loosest sense there, problems in around this sort of area of what moral terms mean, the different competing explanations of those, and weigh up the virtues and commitments of those theories to work out which ones seem to have the best balance, the best overall balance. So I think once you do that type of analysis, that's much more that's subtle, takes a long time, requires balancing different competing things against each other and making an overall evaluation, then I think the non-naturalist position is the one that strikes the right balance.
Okay. Sticking on metaethics, deleted user asks, what are your thoughts on moral nihilism, moral skepticism, and, well, I mean, I assume he's talking about like moral anti-realism, which these terms were synonymous for at some point, and the potential difficulties of grounding moral knowledge in atheism and naturalism. So I guess you can begin by just talking about like anti-realism. Like, is there like any reason why you don't adopt like an anti-realist view?
Well, so like I said, I don't take myself to have a kind of knockdown argument that this is right and therefore proves that moral anti-realism is wrong. But one of the kind of considerations that seems to me quite important is that I think so. The way I think about this to a large extent is that, like in a kind of great tradition of non-naturalists, going back to More, the field of ethical truths is something a bit like the field of purely a priori things, like mathematics or geometry or whatever, or logic, right? Where you are kind of grappling with some abstract reality that's there independently of your thoughts or whatever, independently of your opinions and attitudes about it. And sometimes we have a kind of rational, like intuition or faculty or whatever, which can provide us insight enough to know basic sort of fragments or splinters of what's true, right? So if you think about basic arithmetical truths or whatever, it's not like you really do have a proof that basic things like 1 + 1 = 2. You really don't. I mean, you can construct a proof, of course, but like you can't construct a proof that's actually informative, because any proof like that's going to presuppose you having a lot more mathematical knowledge than that in the first place. Or you can try and take on a logicist thing and reduce it all down, like in the Principia or whatever. But my point is just that you kind of take yourself to just sort of intuitively know certain really basic things, not very much, right? But certain intuitive things like that. I mean, a lot of people will take themselves to just know, for instance, that the law of non-contradiction is true. I'm a little bit less certain about that, I've got to say, but some people think that they have the same type of basic intuitive knowledge there. And it seems to me that at least as plausible a candidate as either of those two is the idea that certain really obvious moral truths to be true, like they're just hurting another agent that can feel the pain for no reason is wrong, right? It's just kind of you just know that it's wrong. And there's something about like just being kind and charitable or whatever that you just kind of know is right. I mean, vague and not very precise, of course. And you can throw me into all sorts of like difficult situations. What would you do if blah, blah, blah? And I'll be scratching my head. But I still take myself to have that type of knowledge. It just seems to me much more plausible than the thesis that none of those claims are true at all, which is the anti-realist position. So, or I go into the conversation there, I think, already with my sort of priors quite heavily stacked against the claim that the anti-realist has got. And I don't think I've never come across a really compelling argument from an anti-realist that made me think that I'd got it all wrong and I was mistaken when I took myself to know basic claims in morality to be true. And the reductions to things like expressivism, where there's no truths or whatever, just seem to be very implausible and come up with lots of different difficulties. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of go into that thinking you're going to have to change my mind. You're going to have to show me something quite good, because I already take myself to have some knowledge here. So I guess maybe I'm answering both aspects of this question at the same time. So it kind of reveals a little bit about how I think, at least in a basic way, you can have some glimpses of insight into moral knowledge. But that also is part of the reason why, I'm not inclined towards moral anti-realism either. Maybe that's a bit of a waffly crap answer, but that's my answer, I think.
No, that was good. To attempt to summarize it, you're saying something along the lines, there's a set of beliefs that you know intuitively, and one of them are sort of your moral beliefs, and you have not been persuaded to give them up by any anti-realist arguments. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think maybe it's worth thinking about it in terms of like that they seem self-evident, and it's not like I have a particularly firm theory of what self-evidence means or works in this context, but they feel as self-evident as any beliefs I have. I think almost any beliefs I have anyway. Maybe beliefs like if I'm hungry or if I'm in pain or something, they're transparent in an even more direct way. But it seems to me very close by are thoughts about like, parallel lines not meeting and killing someone for fun being wrong or whatever. 1 + 1 = 2. Those are very, very close by. And it seems to me reasonable to take yourself to have a strong epistemic kind of grounding for those. At least when you come, it can be overturned. But yeah, something needs to be quite good to overturn that.
Just to ask would this commit you to some kind of a foundationalism in epistemology?
No, I don't think so, because all I'm suggesting is that there's a kind of weighting or something that's very high there. But I don't think that takes me to the view that nothing, that there's no reason why I think that those things are true. So I take myself to be a bit of a holist. So the picture I just painted for you there is part of a wider picture in which I try and, as much as possible, combine all of the things that I think into a tapestry that I make as consistent as I can. But I might change my mind about that, and I might think to myself, for some reason or another, I might read some interesting philosopher, or someone might point something out to me, or whatever. I might just change my mind, whatever reason. And I might reject any of those aspects of things that I just brought up. And if I do, I'll build another picture instead and replace it and try and maintain as many of those existing beliefs that I had in that tapestry as I could, and try and keep it as coherent as I can again. So I take myself to be more of a coherentist in that fashion than a foundationalist. I mean, I still think I could revise. And for instance, I think in reading and engaging with Graham Priest and those types, that made me a lot more open to the idea that certain, in a certain restricted sense, the principle of non-contradiction could admit of exceptions. And so my mind was open to that, but it took quite a lot of quite heavy reading and quite rigorous going deeply into the sorts of arguments that people present there and seeing how it works before I was open to seeing that. So the way you see things, not you, but the way people see things is can limit our imagination, and then sometimes things happen and the way you compute stuff reconfigures into a different mode, and then things that you previously thought were things that were inconceivable to you, now you've rejigged your processor or whatever, and it computes things slightly differently. You suddenly realize avenues of things are now available for you to imagine and understand or whatever, and that's basically like learning or whatever, but it's also reprogramming your brain and mind and thinking about things in a different way. So I think I'm kind of open to changing my mind about those types of things. I don't take it to be that they're definitely foundational. They just sit without anything supporting them. I think that the web of beliefs that they sit in is the kind of mutual interdependent justification for those things. So yeah, I don't know. That's very waffly and vague.
No, that makes. So I guess it would be right to say that you don't have a well worked out epistemology that sort of answers all questions how are these beliefs justified, what is justification, and so on.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not an epistemologist, and formal epistemology makes me fall to sleep. So I don't ask me questions about that. I mean, the things I'm interested in philosophy is metaphysics, logic, philosophy of religion, where it overlaps with those things. I'm not interested in a philosophy of mind. I'm not interested really in epistemology. I don't know. I mean, it's a massive field, right? Philosophy is like a big load of sometimes completely unrelated issues that will get chunked together in a random department that could easily be 3 different departments or 5 or whatever. And it's very rare that you find someone who likes all of it. And there's loads of bits of it that I'm just not interested in at all. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, it seems like epistemology kind of is relevant to every field, at least when it comes to argumentation.
Yeah, but they all say that, don't they? Metaphysics too. So is logic, right? So
Doug wants to ask you a question, so I'm just gonna unmute him and he'll ask. Is that? Yeah, go ahead, Doug. Yeah, Doug, you can ask your question.
Yes. Sorry, can you hear my mic?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, so my question is this, talking on metaethics. So, um, if a person believes, let's say that libertarian free will is necessary for example, categorical norms, right? That in order for something to be truly like prescriptive, um, the agent must be able to voluntarily choose to go against it, right? And he must be able to choose that without being determined one way or another, right?
Hmm.
Um, so in any situation, they can be either in accord with the norm or out of accord, and y- th- th- there's no antecedent condition that necessitates it, right? Otherwise, there'd just be like an automata, right? They like know that it's wrong, but they really couldn't act in accordance with it or against it, right?
Yeah.
Because they would be caused. If somebody also holds that epistemic norms are, only differ from categorical moral norms in their content, meaning that really, like, metaphysically they're the same, right? Wouldn't that just entail that they would also have to subscribe to doxastic voluntarism?
So you're saying if somebody believed that uh, the moral concepts didn't apply unless libertarian free will was true, and the
Yes.
moral concepts did apply, and therefore that libertarian free will was true. If somebody
Yeah.
held that view, and they also held the view that the epistemic norms were relevant, was kind of analogous, relevantly analogous, so that you couldn't be. What are we trying to say? You couldn't like stand in a positive relation to a epistemic norm unless it was possible for you to be like out of accord with it as well. Then shouldn't you take the same view about it must be possible for you to believe or not believe it?
Yeah, meaning it, like you should be able to just voluntarily choose to believe something if you think what if there's evidence, without like me having to convince you or somehow psychologically like manipulate your brain to make you believe it, right?
I mean, maybe too bad for the view. Then I guess if it entails epistemic or doxastic voluntarism, because that seems massively implausible, right? So that seems like a way of doing a reductio or kind of modus tollensing the whole inference back to the beginning, saying something must have gone wrong, right? If it seems to show that doxastic voluntarism is true, we must have made a mistake because doxastic voluntarism doesn't seem to be true. So it depends. I mean, and then I'd be questioning what's gone wrong, which assumption was wrong along the chain there. And I don't know about this, but so one of the few things I really understood when I read Will Gramy, because Jack got me to read Knowledge and Resentment, I think it's called. One of the really interesting bits in there was him talking about Strawson on the relationship between freedom and moral responsibility. And Strawson thinks actually that instead, so normally the way that you put it would be as you did, which is that freedom is a necessary condition for responsibility. So that saying about someone that they are responsible for what they do entails or presupposes that they were free when they did the thing that you're saying they're responsible for. But he flips it over on its head and says something like that actually it's more the concept of freedom is cashed out in terms of responsibility. So what it means to say that somebody is free is that they're responsible for what they do, which is kind of cool. And I think the connection between freedom and moral responsibility is questionable. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that we have to do what Strawson did, but I've also heard Jay Garfield reckons that it actually goes back to St. Augustine was actually the first person to say that that moral responsibility implied freedom in that strong sense, and that it just wasn't the concept prior to that. So it's a kind of Christian idea that's the pre-Christian classical world didn't hold. Indeed, they had much more of a kind of fatalistic view about freedom. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what someone who'd had bought those premises. I guess they have to buy the conclusion. I'm not so sure I want to buy the conclusion. I'm not really clear what I think about the first premise. So I'm not sure what else I can say about that.
Well, Grami's doing an AMA in February, in case you didn't.
Excellent. Oh, well, maybe the questioner could ask him the same question and see what he says.
All right. The remaining questions are really bad. So,
we can just make stuff up if you don't want to ask a bad question.
Yeah, I don't want to. I mean, these questions are just really bad. I mean, I guess. Do you mind like answering like how you just got interested in philosophy of religion, or because you were like doing like tense logic in your PhD, right?
Yeah, that's true. So
was it like Pryor or?
Yeah, that's right. So Arthur Pryor was a logician who kind of single-handedly built tense logic at Oxford in the later on in Oxford, but in the kind of 50s and 60s. And he was doing like formal philosophy in the 50s and 60s when what was fashionable to do at that point was this kind of ordinary language, kind of Wittgensteinian whatever stuff. And so Pryor was working with a small bunch of people like Peter Geach and the Neils and I don't know, a bunch of other people who ended up being influential in logic and formal philosophy afterwards. And his big kind of contribution really was, he's the guy who invented like presentism as a kind of concept, did a bunch of work on the A theory, and invented this discipline, this kind of logical area of tense logic. And my PhD was in the kind of tradition that follows on from that, but was thinking about the problem of future contingents. So it's about how you give a formal semantics for future tense. So logics that have both modal operators like possibly and necessarily and whatnot, and also temporal operators as well. So it will be the case, and it was the case. So you've got kind of a rich logical setup, and the question is like, how do you come up with like models that make sense out of the logical relations that you're trying to capture? So trying to connect that in some way, understand those inferences in terms of what they mean ontologically. So yeah, my PhD was about nothing to do with philosophy of religion whatsoever. But I think my time in academia, I ended up kind of like falling out of love with it for a while, which I think happens to a lot of people when they specialize in something very technical. And I ended up sort of just being bored by my own work to some extent and just not enjoying it as much anymore. And which is why I left academia and just decided to do something else, which was a bit crazy, really, because I spent 10 years becoming an academic and then I just stopped doing it. But then I think without philosophy in my life at all, I was quite kind of lost. And I think subconsciously I came back to it, but in bits. So I started like reading about religion and Christianity and stuff, and found that interesting, in the history and stuff like that, sort of peripheral cultural products and stuff, getting into things, and being curious and trying reading and whatever, finding stuff out. And I think it led me bit by bit back into philosophy again, via a different angle, and that made it sort of refreshed everything. So a few years of thinking about completely different things, and then found myself unwittingly thinking about philosophical things, but different philosophical things. But I was just only doing what I was curious with, and not doing, following a publication trail and, talking to people at conferences and building on stuff like that. I was just following my interest. And I think in many ways that's the best way to do philosophy, is as a hobby. It's much more fun to do it like that. Doing it as a living can be fun, but it can also turn something. If you do what you love for a living, that ruins it. And I think that's right for me. I think I'm a better philosopher because I'm not a full-time academic. And I've actually published a bunch of stuff recently in better journals and whatnot, now that I'm not a proper academic and a kind of lay academic, or what, I don't even know what the term is. So yeah, I kind of got back into it that way, I guess. I'm not sure.
Independent scholar.
An independent scholar, yeah. But Quentin Smith was an independent scholar as well. He was much more important than me, of course, but he just decided that being an academic meant that he couldn't do enough philosophy because he was too busy marking and going to meetings and stuff. So he just had to quit. And so he did. So he just decided to not do that anymore. I imagine, although I have no idea about this, but I imagine he was rich enough to be able to just sit around and do philosophy all the time. I work as well.
Well, he became a recluse, right?
Is that right? I don't know.
So I hope that's how you end up.
Well, so I'll join you as being a recluse.
You could spend all your time on Discord yelling at people.
It's true. No, hopefully not.
Let's see. Timber asked, how would you describe philosophy of religion as a subfield? Is your opinion much different than before you got into philosophy of religion?
I mean, I think there's definitely a kind of the people who do technical philosophy, logical, mathematical, philosophy of physics, those types of hard end of the discipline, definitely think that what they're doing is the proper difficult stuff, and the softer end of the discipline, your ethics is and your political philosophies, that type of thing, that's much easier. I think that's the view that people who do mathematical philosophy think about people who do non-mathematical philosophy. And maybe I would have had that opinion back in the day because I didn't really read philosophy of religion, but I was reading a whole ton of logic and stuff. And I mean, to some extent, that's right. I mean, it's just completely different discipline. I mean, some people are really good at chess, right? And they're just amazing at that. And I imagine that those people think that being good at chess means that they're superior to people who, I don't know, are good at some crude kind of football or something, right? There's just, maybe that's right, but just being a really, really super good at one thing, just is kind of incommensurable with being really super good at something else. I don't know if you could just, anyone who does that type of mathematical philosophy could do every other type of philosophy if they felt like it. I'm not sure that's right. I think that you're probably just best suited to a certain way of looking at things. I think I'm quite well suited to thinking about metaphysical questions in a broad way. And obviously there are much better logicians and mathematicians than I am. And I'm happy to leave them to it, actually. Basic things I know are plenty. And it's fun to just wander off and find things that you're good at, just being good at those. So I don't know whether, philosophy of religion is a discipline of philosophy where at the professional level, it's high quality, of course. And people who tell you that it's trash and there's nobody good in philosophy of religion don't know what they're talking about, and don't understand it then, if that's what they think, because it's a very, I mean, and certainly these days there's loads of people doing it. It's competitive and it's interesting. There's a whole load of stuff going on. But that's true for every area of philosophy, because there's way more people doing it now than there's ever been. There's always more people doing it. So it's a huge field with more stuff in it than you could possibly read in a lifetime. So it's fun. I mean, or at least I find parts of it fun. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how to evaluate it. I haven't read most of it, right? So I don't know really, because it's too vast to get your head around. But there's loads of it that I'm familiar with, and a lot of that's really interesting.
Is one criticism of the field is that it's sort of like too focused on like Protestantism or classical European theism.
Yeah,
and it doesn't like engage with like Eastern. But I assume you find like that stuff to be fun, the engagement with like classical theism and other stuff like that, right?
Yeah. Well, that's right. I don't think it will keep my interest for the rest of my life quite as much, right? I mean, classical theism is an idea, and it's fun to play around with it. But there's other, like you say, other religious modes, other ways of thinking about things. And I'm not a religious person, right? I'm not a seeker. I've never been religious or had any real inclination to be religious. So it's not like I'm like super interested in, delving into Hinduism next and stuff like that. I'm not really, I don't know. I'm just as, I pick things up and put them down again, and I don't know why I like one thing and not another. I just do. So I think that's the way to just remain curious and just interested in stuff. So I'll probably get bored of thinking about these types of problems after a while. But I mean, there's something quite nice about the stuff I found myself publishing in, because it's a mixture of like issues in philosophy of time, metaphysics, and philosophy of religion. And there's some like logic stuff about infinity, stuff about philosophy of time. So it kind of relates back to what my training was in. But it's also in an area which is fresh and interesting, and there's like fun stuff. And I suppose actually one of the things about philosophy of religion that makes it different to other areas is that it has a kind of popular level interest. So people, like lay people, are interested in it, whereas very few lay people are interested in like metaphysics of modality or whatever. A little bit interested in that if you really ask them about it, but almost everybody at some point has considered basic questions in that philosophy of religion would bring up, like whether there's an afterlife or if God exists, or whatever, like those types of things. So and then there's, and that means people like debating them, and it means that you can. So a weird journey took me from like becoming curious about religion to having a debate with William Lane Craig, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite cool, because if I had gone in a different direction and got curious about some other field, the main participants would be inaccessible, and there wouldn't be a public platform or any kind of participatory role like that. So it's an unusual field in that it's kind of popular with the public to some extent, right? It's a niche, geeky public that's interested in it, but it's some aspect of the public anyway. So that's quite cool.
Right. Yeah, it seems like whether God exists or not, it's probably going to impact more people than like formalism or something like philosophy of math, like what the view of math is. Yeah,
especially because our cultures, I mean, the kind of, I guess, European heritage is Christian, and that means that those questions that dominate this field are questions that you're likely to ask yourself because they're cultural products that you inherit. So I guess maybe if things had gone very differently, it's conceivable that people wouldn't ask that question about whether God exists, because maybe it's not an inherent idea. It's conceivable. For instance, there are versions of Buddhism which don't really have any kind of deity in them whatsoever, or notion of creator or whatever. And it's just perfectly possible to think that that could have been the dominant cultural background, and that these questions would be as peripheral as like random whether ersatz-ism is true in metaphysics of modality or whatever. But it's not. We live in this context, so yeah.
All right. I guess we have 15 more minutes, and this question is interesting, so I'll ask. Timber asked, so Oppe says this a lot, where sort of like your background theory is like prior to any argument. So like whether you find an argument sound or not is going to depend on what background theory you're operating with. So like a naturalist is going to find different arguments sound or not than like a theist or something.
Yeah.
And so like the focus should sort of be on, let's compare the background theories as opposed to like look at individual arguments.
Yeah.
So Timber asks two questions. The first one is, what do you think about this approach to philosophy? And the second question is, in order to sort of like to do like theory choice, we need to like agree on the same data, right? We need to have like the same phenomenon as our target. So do you think that like theists and atheists can even do so much as even agree on the data set to be explained, let alone like what theory that best explains it?
Yeah, I mean, you can overstate that position of Graham's, and I'm not sure. So, it's not like arguments are completely pointless. And he does draw the position quite vividly, right? Like as if, your attitude about arguments soundness is just going to sort of fall out of your prior decisions about which things are true and which things are not. So that's it. There's no point really talking about arguments. The question of whether they're valid is kind of trivial, and the question of whether they're sound is just a question of what you believe. So it's no point wondering about the arguments. But the purpose of arguments, I think, isn't to... So you've got this kind of like rationalist sort of, and actually I think it is reasonable to characterize a rationalist theologian who's trying to prove things about the way that the world is, like a priori deductions about the nature of the world, are kind of maybe like Aquinas, or maybe like Spinoza or someone trying to just from the armchair deduce things, maybe Descartes, I don't know. But and I don't think that's the right... Maybe Andrew Locke, I guess, is the modern day version of that. But I don't think that that's the right way to do things. I don't think that I'm tempted to think that philosophy doesn't really discover truths like that. It's not like a scientific method for the armchair scientist or something. I think it's more of something about trying to manage like chaos in your belief set and apply order, and just to try and make things as sensible as possible. And it's not quite the same as discovering truths, right? It's more about making sense of things as best as you can. And the good thing about arguments is that their purpose is, at least one of their purposes can be to expose how your commitments should lead you to, or how your commitments might lead you to holding both of two parts of a contradiction. And if so, then they do something, right? So they can be like instruments for self-diagnosing inconsistencies in your beliefs, or someone else diagnosing them in your beliefs, or something. And I think that's useful. I think it's also helpful. There's lots of uses for arguments, right? Another one of them is to think about just the putting forwards and defending of arguments as a way of like training or something. Like you might say, like, what's the point of going for a run if you're not like trying to get from point A to point B? Like, I guess I can understand if you're going to run home from somewhere because you want to go home, or you run to the shop or something, but sometimes you're just going for a run. Like, what's the point if it doesn't get you anywhere? And it kind of, it's like, you can do it because it serves a different purpose, even if it's not getting you somewhere. It's like helping you, making you healthy or something. And advancing an argument can be a similar thing. You can do it for the sake of the exercise. It can be fun to debate things, right? People in debates will take sides for the sake of the argument, and without like believing them necessarily, but trying to explore the idea together. And there's a kind of structure for exploring it. I'll defend this, you defend that, and we'll see how far we can get. That's a good way of just both of us coming to understand the issues, because it's like shining a light on them. It's giving us a way of interrogating the concept. So it's kind of like almost like educational use or something that arguments can have there too. So I think there's lots of things arguments can be good for, but like, I guess I agree with Graham that they're not, that kind of Lockean idea that you have advanced an argument, therefore you've won or something. I don't, that just kind of seems, I don't know, naive or something almost.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, that's not how you discover truths about things outside your head. That's not right. So, and okay, I guess the other way of looking at it is, if somebody's doing that, then it can be useful to interrogate that argument to show why what they're doing is wrong. So I guess most of the time when I'm thinking about philosophy of religion, I'm destroying rather than creating. Create to destroy, right? Because I'm sure that there's, well, I'm not sure, but I think that you don't prove things about the outside world, really. Very rarely does anything happen like that. And so when somebody says that they've done it, they probably haven't. And a real exercise there is just trying to understand why they're wrong, right? And I go into that with a very high prior thinking that they're not right. If they're trying to prove, say, for instance, that time has a beginning. I don't know if time has a beginning or not, right? I'm not committed to the view that it didn't have a beginning, but I am pretty firmly committed to the view that you can't prove that it did have a beginning, right? I just think that's probably beyond our capacities to do that. And if there's an argument, it's not this, you haven't stumbled across it, certainly in like a blog post or YouTube video or something, that no one has actually proven any of those things like that. And the game there is just working out why that doesn't work and defusing the bomb. And that can be, that can show you loads of things and can be really useful. And I take myself to be doing that type of thing in my, academic philosophy of religion stuff.
Right. Now I want to add something to that, but Timber, go ahead and.
Oh yeah, hey, this is Timber. I just maybe the part I was more concerned with was like the second question, which is fundamental. I think there's like maybe an issue with this whole approach is that I just don't see why a theist and atheist will agree on the same data set. I mean, for example, like if you were disagreeing, if like a nihilist and like a mereological nihilist and a universalist were sort of comparing theories, they may just then, the universalist will just say, oh, well, I just take it to be the case that these events occurred, and then I need to explain that, right? And then maybe a nihilist will just say that, well, that those events didn't occur or something like that, right? So
yeah,
the data set is just not going to be like, why should we think that the data sets will be the same or mostly the same? It seems like the data itself is like going to be theory laden. That's like the worry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think so I'm not convinced that there's such a radical disagreement that they can't talk to each other about anything. And the question is, you need to find the part of common ground, the hinge so that the door can open or whatever. And I'm not clear that there's no possibility of common ground, like kind of like Greg Banson kind of, precept thing about like there's like literally nothing in common between a theist and an atheist or something. I don't think that's right. And I'm not sure whether there's really a radical problem here that's, do you think that's true for, people who argue about different interpretations of quantum mechanics, for instance, an Everettian and a Bohmian? Is there some data that they agree on or not? I mean, there's a question about that, of course, like what the extent to which they're talking past each other. But it just feels like that's a generic question that applies.
Well, let's just take
all
like
over,
the
basically.
resurrection. Let's say the resurrection of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
Like I may consider that as a Christian to be an event, but that's certainly a theory-laden data point, right? And I'll say, how do you explain that? And maybe the atheist will just deny it, right? So that's the kind of
Well,
worry.
I mean, but so it's possible to talk past each other then, of course, but it's not clear that you couldn't get into that and say, you take it to be an event, and how do you explain it? But I might ask you, well, why do you take it to be an event? I'm not so sure. Like, let's start the conversation a couple of steps back from where you tried to start and see if the common ground actually is earlier on in the process of like, what do you take to be a good historical method or something? And do I agree with you about that? If I do, then maybe we need to look at the evidence then to see which evidence convinced you that it was an event, blah, blah, blah. We can probably, I'd be surprised if you were saying, well, trying to walk backwards down the conversation like that there's no point where we would agree with each other makes me, I just don't think that's right. There probably is some point where we agree, and then there's just some question about why we drew different conclusions from the thing we agreed about, and then we'd have to work out, where we went wrong or where one of us went wrong or whatever. So yeah, I think that it's just general disagreement. Just if somebody likes something and you don't like it, you could explain why you like it, blah, blah, blah. I don't think, I guess I'm just not really seeing the problem.
Oh, but it may be just the case that we have to argue about the data before we actually do the theory comparison, something like that.
Yeah, but I'm suggesting that there will be data to share, and it's very unlikely that there isn't any data. And so the point then is just the point where you start diverging. That's where you want to start.
No, I take your point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, there was something I want to add on. It seems like you made the point that not all arguments are the same, right? And some are going to be more useful than the others, right, Alex?
Did I say that? I think that sounds right anyway.
Because it strikes me like you have sort of like arguments like logical problem of evil, where you sort of take all the premises are supposed to be belief the other person already holds. That's like part of his network of belief, and then show that they, like in conjunction, entail a contradiction. And that seems to be useful, even with the whole background considered. And then you have things like the kalam, where you have like the first premise, right? If you don't accept, it seems like it's the type of thing, if you don't already accept the premise, there's just no way the argument's ever going to be persuasive. And those seem to be the useless type of arguments.
Well, so, let's be clear that arguments so this is another thing about arguments are, so next door to philosophy of religion is apologetics. And that's philosophy of religion, some sort of with a specific kind of intention in mind, which is to convert the other person. That's the point of apologetics. It's a principle. It's a tool of conversion, which is a kind of Christian idea. Not every religion has that. So that does, if you come at philosophy of religion with an apologetics kind of background or angle or whatever, then you're thinking the point of an argument like the Kalam is to persuade someone who doesn't believe it in the first place. And then you might say, well, this fails that because it's, the litmus test is someone who just folds their arms and says, well, I don't believe it. Is saying the argument to them going to make them convert and become a Christian or something? I guess it's not going to do that, right? But from a philosophical point of view, that's kind of less interesting because it's a psychological kind of impact or something. Like, who cares? If you're not a Christian trying to convert people to your religion, who cares what an individual person comes to believe? That doesn't matter. Why would that matter? What's interesting is what follows from what, like what's actually true or something. What can we say about this? What actually can we establish? That's what's interesting. And what someone then goes off and believes afterwards is kind of inconsequential. So I guess I think you're right in the sense that like the Kalam's probably not a very good instrument for persuasion, but actually it's quite interesting from a philosophical point of view, right? Like it's fun to think about. It's interesting, and it brings up a lot of like related questions that are independently interesting, like the nature of time and of infinity and stuff like that, causation, whatever. That it's cool to think about those things. And I don't, if you take away the fact that it's an instrument that's trying to persuade people, and just think about like, hey, there's this fun argument that's trying to say this. Like if I explained to you Frege's argument for Platonism, he wasn't going around knocking on people's doors, telling it to them, asking them to join his club or whatever. That's not an instrument of apologetics. He thought that's how it was. That was how he explained his view. So I don't know. I think, am I interacting with what you're saying properly? I think I'm just trying to say that I think it's not a very helpful, persuasive measure. But
oh no, I don't disagree. I mean, what I had in mind was just something along the lines of, if, for example, either I don't have the intuition of the first premise, or I don't believe in like non-inferential justification, and the premise is just not part of my network of beliefs, or is entailed by anything in my network of beliefs. It doesn't seem that there's anything further to do regarding the kalam, at least its first premise. And it doesn't seem that I would be irrational or anything for not accepting it. So that's what I said, like, I see issues with those types of arguments that rely on those types of principles that can't sort of be justified further.
But don't you think that...
Sorry, go ahead.
Craig does have supporting arguments for the premise.
Well, he wrote this book in 1993, I believe, with Quentin Smith. I think it was called... it's called something like... I always forget the title. The Big Bang, God and Atheism, or something like something. I'm sure you know the book where it's like 6 papers by Quentin Smith, 6 papers by Craig. Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. That's it.
Yeah, right.
And in there, Smith has this very good paper where he goes through like all of those supporting arguments, and Craig sort of like concedes to all of them and falls back on the claim that it's like a metaphysical intuition. And so it seems like he's given up on that move. But yeah, I didn't mean to like get into a discussion regarding that. But I mean, an hour and 30 minutes have passed, so I mean, I know you hate doing the promotional stuff, so I guess I'll just repeat the there's like I pinned your page, like your fill paper page and your blog, and people can find your stuff there. And you have also an upcoming paper soon, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be 2021, right? I assume within this year.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And hopefully the Grim Reaper stuff. And I'm working on another one. I mean, I have about 3 that I'm kicking around, but I've been working with Wes on another one, Wes Morriston. But that's also a kind of Grim Reaper one. Like I mentioned, this guy Lorenzo Luna and Jacob Erasmus have got a paper out from last year, which is it's a version of the Grim Reaper argument, but it's about like recursive determination functions, and whether they prove that the universe had a beginning. Weirdly, and Luna is one of those a priori metaphysicians as well. So it's fun to share why that enterprise doesn't work. And Wes and I are getting close to a coherent position of opposition on that view as well. So of that, the Grim Reaper stuff I was explaining before, the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, a paper on counting down from infinity, which I before, and this one in mind, which is about counting up to infinity, coming out like whenever, some point soon. So there's a bunch of things coming out.
On the Kalam specifically, you have one out now, which is Endless and Infinite, right?
That's right, yeah.
And then you have 3 coming out. You have one on Grim Reaper. You have one coming out very soon. What was that on?
on the one in mind is about counting up.
Counting up.
So
And
it's
then
on
you
the
said-
successive addition argument, premise 2.
Okay. Okay, so that's sort of like similar to the one you wrote last year, endless and infinite.
Well, actually, the endless and infinite one is about the other argument for premise 2.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so there's 2 arguments for premise 2, and this one targets the other argument.
That's right.
Yeah, and then you have yet another paper that you're working on, right?
Which one are we talking about now? The counting down one.
No, you had Grim Reaper, the counting down, and I thought you said.
Oh yeah, and this argument from a recursive determination function.
Okay, and that also goes back to the Kalam or arguments.
Well, it does because it's the version of the Grim Reaper argument. Conclusion is the universe had a beginning, so it's the same family of arguments. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thanks. So I guess that was that. So I just want to say thank you for the AMA. And,
yeah, no trouble.
And sorry if any of the questions were like really bad.
None of the questions were bad. They were all good.